everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Divorce and Separation Coach podcast. This week, we're talking about a really interesting topic. What are the key ingredients to a good divorce? So we need to start by defining what good means in the context of divorce. It's not usually a word that's associated with divorce, but we will talk about that, but also what are the characteristics of a good divorce, and especially what mistakes to avoid making to avoid your divorce getting out of hand. So to talk about this, I've invited Corinne Parke and Bethan Hill-Howells, who both work for Keystone Law. Corinne has been advising clients on family law matters for over 20 years, and she's got particular expertise in applications under the Children Act 1989, complex financial applications upon divorce, and issues involving cohabiting couples. Bethan is a family senior associate who advises on all aspects of family law. Specifically, Bethan guides clients through divorce and finance processes, often involving an international element, which is how we know each other, as well as contact arrangements for children, including complex private Children Act proceedings. Welcome, both of you. Thank you for joining me.
Hi there.
So let's start with that big question. What does good mean in the context of divorce? And I think there's kind of two elements to that. There's the good for the divorce process itself, and good with regards to the long-term outcomes that you achieve through the negotiation or the hearings. So maybe Corinne, do you want to give us your interpretation of what good looks like in this context?
Okay, so maybe I'll deal with the first kind of part of this and what good looks like throughout the process of a divorce. I think really, I mean, each client has a different story and a different situation, whether it be what's important to them in relation to their children or what outcome they want to achieve.
Yeah.
I think to have a good divorce throughout the process can mean different things to different people. So perhaps it's about not incurring too much in the way of costs, but also being able to have a conversation and be able to maintain the relationship with their husband or wife to enable them to perhaps to co-parent, or even if they're maybe still living in the same house together, so they can achieve what they need to, but in a very amicable and calm environment. There are different ways that you can achieve that, which I'm sure we'll get to later. But I think it's being mindful of each party and what they need and how to approach that.
Okay, I love that. Bethan, how would you interpret that?
I think if I deal with the process side in terms of what it looks like on the ground, I think there's several factors to make it a good divorce. I think the key thing is having that advice early on, but not just advice from me or Corinne, but having that team around you. You almost want a kind of one-stop shop where we can pass you on to the pensions advisors or the divorce coaches or the accountants. That, you know, it's not just a case of having a divorce, it's everything else that comes with it and follows it. And then having a good person on the other side, the other solicitor that you can have a good relationship with. I think part of the problem, and I'm sure we'll go on to it later on in this conversation, is not being able to pick up the phone to the other solicitor or becoming more aggressive because of the solicitors rather than what's actually happening on the ground, and then avoiding court as much as possible, because that's only ever going to delay things. So as much as you can possibly do is to keep it amicable and try mediation or round tables that we offer anyway, but having that team around you that you can kind of lean on, you know, like Chloe, we can kind of push the emotion to you and help that area, and having a therapist or a counsellor on board makes our job a lot more streamlined, and it kind of keeps the fees down as well. So having that process on top of being able to have an amicable relationship with your other side or other party, as it were, is really important.
Yeah, so what I hear from both of you is really it comes down to conflict, because the more conflict there is, the more you spend, the longer it takes, the more stress you experience, and the worse it is for your children. So ultimately, good in that context would be keeping things and I think it's something that's often misunderstood as well, that the term amicable, people say, well, we're not friends. Could you explain a little bit? Maybe Corinne, I'll pass the baton back to you again. How would you explain to somebody what amicable means?
So I think amicable can be, as you said, you don't have to be the best of friends. You're going through a divorce or a separation for a reason. You need to be able to co-parent if you've got children, to be able to discuss what your children need, to be open to communication, open to negotiation. It's when people become closed off and very litigious or very closed-minded to options. That can lead to the relationship really breaking down to the state that we then have limited options, and it's difficult to claw it back. So amicable is more about, I think, communication skills, which is obviously where you come in, Chloe, and being able to keep those lines open really helps the process.
I agree. So Bethan, from your experience, are there some key factors that contribute to a smoother divorce and make it more amicable?
Oh, how long of a list do you want?
If you had to choose 3 or 4, I guess.
I think the first one is having that dialogue with your client, to be able to have the difficult conversations. We're not just yes people. Where solicitors shouldn't be letterboxes. They should be able to give that difficult advice that the client might not like. You might have to have difficult conversations, tense words. They might not like you, but that's almost your purpose. So to be able to be firm with your client, not just saying yes just to keep them happy. And I think the next one is them having realistic expectations of what's going to happen, because lots of times they want the world and it's not reality. It doesn't work like that. That's not how the court system look at how to determine how the house is split or who gets what in the pension. So having those abilities to have that realistic expectations, which comes with being able to be firm or strong with your client when you need to. And then making sure it's the right fit. Not everyone's going to want me to be their lawyer or Corinne to be their lawyer, but taking that time to get to know your client. And that's why we have those initial meetings, because we might just not work and we might not gel. And then the final thing is obviously having, if in an ideal world, the husband or wife on the other side is just as amicable and wants to engage. Is when people don't engage and it almost becomes a war when it doesn't need to be. And then you end up issuing court proceedings that they can't really afford. They're going to spend all their money on legal fees and then nobody wins. So they're kind of I would say, key factors, unless I've missed any, Corinne.
I think all I would add to that is the parties being open to other ways of reaching agreements. So things like mediation, things like roundtable meetings or the collaborative law process. It doesn't have, some people come to us and presume that they're automatically jumping in to a highly litigious court application. And that's not the way it needs to be. There are so many different options and they're growing and growing, and the courts really encourage the parties to look at non-court dispute resolution. So we can sit down with the other party and discuss it. We can get those third parties involved, which then allows the clients to maintain a lot more control over their settlement. In the end, it's their family, it's their finances. We're just there to kind of oil the cogs in such a way and get them to the end. So it's so much easier if clients are open-minded as to what options are available. Rather than just immediately kind of single out the court process, which is going to take a lot longer, cost a lot more, and you probably won't like the outcome at the end of it.
So it comes back to those expectations, actually, that Bethan was talking about, understanding what the process looks like, what the law says, quite simply, but also understanding that it's a negotiation. I think a lot of people don't realize they think that if they, they file with the court, that means that the judge is immediately going to step in and make decisions for them.
Exactly.
Realizing,
Exactly. And
people don't know that.
It's this idea that because they want it means that it must happen. And lots of our job is negotiation. And I think what I didn't really necessarily speak about earlier is having counsel, so barristers' input quite early on is really quite key. And I think people are nervous of bringing barristers on because they see it as a cost or they see it as litigation maybe. But actually having that expertise on top of ours so we can have a collaborative discussion. Your case is much better planned out. It doesn't have to go to court, but it can include private FDRs or negotiations around the table, and that willingness to actually say, well, that might be my top figure, that's my open figure, but actually I would settle for this. And it's having that ability to see past, this is mine and I want it and that's all I want. That's half of our battle, is having a sensible conversation from the outset. And I think that would save a lot of stress and money in court. You don't need to be there. Fingers crossed, although Corinne and I will tell you we're in court all of the time, but I think we'd both rather not be on certain cases. That you don't need it, it doesn't warrant it, we can settle this. But some people unfortunately don't want to engage in that, which is quite sad.
Yeah, that's where I usually see people, really break down in terms of any kind of communication, is as soon as people start digging their heels and they get very fixed on positions. And a lot of the work I do with them is thinking about what the why is behind that position and whether there's another way of achieving that why. And it's not necessarily the one solution you're offering. And I think people don't realize also that if they go to court, the judge isn't necessarily going to pick their idea or their spouse's idea. They might go with a third solution.
Absolutely.
So that's also important to understand, because it's not, you don't necessarily win in that sense.
No, I mean, you're in the hands of a judge, and it sounds terrible, but it could be what side of the bed that judge got out of that day as to what mood they're in and what judgment you're going to get. And it's completely in his hands or her hands. You're right. As soon as they set foot inside a courtroom, that positional stance and that need to win comes into it. And that's what then causes so much conflict. Whereas if you can step outside of the courtroom, whether it's more of a formal arrangement like a private FDR or some kind of arbitration, or whether it's a round table meeting or just negotiations between solicitors, that's fine. There's so many other options just to stop people being quite so positional. And I think where you come in, Chloe, and where your role is to encourage them to have that open-mindedness and see what the other options are. And kind of to encourage them to keep open and be able to talk to each other.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure it's a big part of what you do as well, is manage those expectations and try and allow people to think about different solutions that aren't necessarily the one they came in with.
Exactly.
So if we start with the very start of the process, people who are just about to divorce or, having those conversations, is there anything they can do in those very early days to set the tone right and get things going on the right footing? So maybe Bethan, I'll send that to you.
I think the problem that I think most people have is that they only need a lawyer because things have gone wrong. But actually getting that early advice is key, because they might not have even separated yet. They might just be thinking about it. But have an understanding of what that process looks like. It's not fun for anybody, but understanding that and being able to set in motion the right things, i.e. speaking to a financial advisor, speaking to a coach, speaking to a counsellor, having an idea of what happens rather than just barreling into it, it causes chaos, but having that idea of what's going to happen, I think, is really, really key. And then being able to, I sound like a broken record, but having positive conversation. You don't have to like your soon to be ex-partner. There's a reason that you're splitting up, but having an understanding of what maybe they want. And have you had a conversation of what that looks like? Are you willing to sit down? And you can use lawyers in a different way so they can get their own separate advice. But if you're relatively okay in terms of speaking to each other, you can sit down and have those adult conversations without needing to bring in lawyers, because some people view lawyers as obviously money-making machines, or however they want to view us, and actually both of them having their own separate advice, coming together before it all explodes, because most of the time you can probably sort it out between yourselves and then go back to your respective lawyers with any questions you have. But it's that kind of key conversations at the start, I think, is massive. And then obviously if it doesn't go the way you want it to go, or one person's not speaking, having an open mind as to why aren't they speaking to you, or why don't they agree with your proposal. Like you said earlier, it's the why. You might not like it, but why don't you like it, or why are you opposing that? And actually taking time to think about it and consider it, because lots of people view certain assets as possessions. Obviously, most of the time, the house, they're hell-bent on keeping it, but they might not understand that it's not affordable, or do they even want to live in it because it holds memories that maybe are quite painful for them, and can they even go on the mortgage, or what's going to happen with it? It seems like a lot of it is, I have to keep it. When actually, if we explore, well, you could sell it and you can get the money from it and buy something smaller, and or somewhere else that you'd always wanted to live. It's having that idea of, why am I opposing things just for the sake of it, or having an open mind, that I hope that Corinne and I can bring to the table together, is having those difficult conversations and bringing matters forward and allowing them time to go off and think about it. You know, they don't have to make decisions there and then, but having that time in advance when you're not in court proceedings and you're not having to make really just difficult decisions on the day when your barrister's there, I'm there, we're in a room that there's paint peeling off the walls, it's too hot, or the windows don't open, and you're already stressed, and then we're telling you, you've got to make a decision now, because otherwise this deal might fall apart and you've got to go. That's stressful for anybody. I would be stressed by that. So having an open mind before you end up in an FDR and you're stressed and you just want it over, but you might not want to agree to it. But Corinne and I often see people just say yes to things because they just want the stress over and done with, whereas actually, if you planned it better, you wouldn't be anywhere near it.
It comes back to that early advice and the expectations, right? Understanding what you can look at.
I think all I would add to that is kind of not what to do, but what not to do. And it sounds awful, especially in these days of social media and internet, but please try and avoid believing everything that's written on internet websites, because most of the time they're not correct, or you misinterpret exactly what's right. Every case is different, so just because this case says that this is the amount that you're going to receive doesn't necessarily mean that that's what you would get. And friends are there to support you and to provide emotional support. That, oh well, in my divorce I received X amount of money, that's what you should be entitled to, is again something that's just going to make you more positional and cause problems. Friends they're absolutely invaluable and they have their place, but they're not legal advisors, they're not financial advisors. You need to rely on them for support, for a glass of wine, for a trip to the shops, whatever it may be, just not the legal side of things.
Agreed. And that scares me always when people say, oh, I heard from my friend or from my cousin or whatever. And that's always, that's always a very tricky proposition. The reality is that what the average folk consider fair is interpreted differently to what the court defines as fair. And it might feel morally wrong, but actually that's just the way the law is written. So
the way the court is, and well, that's a problem we come across all the time. It's like, well, it's not fair, or the process is wrong, and it's like, well, I'm afraid we can only work within the remits of what the court is and the way that the process works. And yes, it's very slow and very clunky, and the forms don't give you enough opportunity to have a voice and to really explain what's going on. But we can only do what we can do with the help of all the other external experts that we can bring in. But we can, say, going backwards, we can always try and avoid all of that by sitting down and dealing with it sensibly.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's really what it boils down to, is keeping that communication going. And I think, with regards to that initial mistake that I see a lot of people make is, especially in an international context, because there's such a race to securing the right jurisdiction, is filing without speaking to your spouse first. I find that's always really hard to backpedal from, because it's, you can send all the letters you want and say as much as you want that, no, I intend for it to be amicable. You've started by shooting first, and the reality is that the other person feels cornered and betrayed, and it makes it very difficult to recover the communication afterward.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you find that a lot, Chloe, that they make the applications and then think about the impact from there?
Well, yeah, that's one of the big debates I have with clients who come to me early on, is that piece around, with international clients. How do you balance that intent to keep things amicable with the reality that you do need to file first in the right place for you and protect your interests? And it's very difficult, because unfortunately the way the system is organized, there really is no way of doing it right without making yourself vulnerable. But if you can from the very beginning have some respectful conversations, and maybe it's a matter of just giving your spouse a bit of a heads up, like literally the day before, so that it's irreversible already. But you've at least given them you've done them the courtesy of telling them, rather than them getting an email in their inbox telling them, oh, by the way, your spouse is asking for a divorce, because that, I think, antagonizes people right off the bat.
That completely, and that's the problem, is that as soon as you've done that, it's out the window. You can't. I don't think you can backpedal that much that there's ever a level of trust anymore. And I think that's the battle that you have, is that especially when there's children involved, and then the jurisdiction race is even more important if one wants to relocate back to America or wherever they've come from. I understand the practical side and wanting to issue first, so you've taken that kind of jurisdictional race in your hands, but actually having that conversation, because half the time I don't think people actually want that jurisdictional race, or they're not necessarily thinking about it once they've just separated. And then imagine the following morning, the night before, you've had a really difficult discussion, you've decided to end your marriage, and then the following morning you find an email in your inbox saying that so and so's just issued, because it is that quick. And I don't think I would be very impressed, or I just wouldn't have the trust there anymore, because I would then start to question, well, how long has he been thinking about that? Who's he been speaking to? What kind of prep has he been doing? Because it doesn't, it would have taken time to draft that application to get the jurisdiction. So then that's what creates all of the conflict and the war, because if you're on the back foot from day dot, you're then going to spend the whole time trying to catch up, and then second guess what they're trying to do. So you almost become more litigious, because you're trying to outmatch what they've done. So it just goes completely out the window when it comes to jurisdiction, and it's difficult, because you have to do it if you're genuinely concerned, yes, but maybe try to have a conversation first, because they might not intend to make an application in that jurisdiction, and then you've created all this conflict, and at times Corinne will agree with me, complete war for nothing.
For nothing, absolutely. And the reality is that if you're going to be trying to do this amicably, the jurisdiction matters less. Of course, you're operating within a legal framework, but still, if you're going to, the idea is to come to an agreement between the two of you. Actually, it's not as important.
Exactly.
I think a lot of people want to have that backup of knowing that the law is on their side if it did come to that. And that really starts things off on the wrong footing.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, Corinne, in your mind, as a practicing solicitor, what role do you play in helping people to keep the tone amicable and to help things, avoid an escalation of conflict, really?
What role do I play? I think the way that we approach proceedings is very important. So if we went in a very litigious way and very abrupt way, whether it's communicating with solicitors or the other party directly, that approach, I think, can set the tone very quickly as to what route we're going down. We're all both members of Resolution that have quite a strong code, about the way that you're supposed to communicate with other parties and experts, and that can set the tone very clearly. So I would always say that someone should aim to have a resolution member as a lawyer. I think we need to keep an open mind as to what options are available for the client. So, as I said, whether we should send them to mediation and take perhaps a step back, whether we should consider whether there is a possibility of collaboration, or whether there's a possibility of roundtable meetings. Look, in some situations, it's not right for a client for whatever reason it may be, and we need to kind of balance those needs. But I think if there are some lawyers, I won't name them, that are very, we're going to court, the end, don't consider any other option. But I think it's very important that we don't do that. But don't get me wrong, if something needs to be done quickly, then you need to do it. But you can still keep the lines of communication open.
Yeah, that's quite a difficult balancing act, because your client wants to feel that you're in their corner, that you've got their back. But you also play a role in terms of regulating them in their decision, and really not adding fuel to the fire. And I think that, what you touched upon is the words you use in correspondence, and telling your client, actually, making that comment is just going to antagonize them. It's not useful. You're really on the front line to help them avoid those mistakes, which are obviously very tempting when they're distraught. But that cool-headed and more strategic approach, I guess, is a big advantage.
I think you also need to have those difficult conversations with the client. So, for example, if they have children and they need to discuss what the arrangements are going to be, and they're still able to speak to their other side, whether how they approach those conversations, what kind of language they're going to use, how they're going to communicate it. Is it a face-to-face conversation? Is it a text message? Whatever it may be. That makes a big difference. Yeah. So having that, it sounds like you're teaching people to suck eggs, but that ability to communicate and how they communicate it is really important. And a lot of clients don't see that as our job. But actually, if things unfortunately escalated, to be able to show, look, we're being reasonable about this. We were open to communication. You can't imply that any of the language was in any way threatening or coercive in any way. It helps everybody.
I agree. Absolutely. Bethan, anything to add on that?
I think the other thing that I would add is the way in which lawyers correspond with each other, and it's become a real bugbear of mine where they can't even call you by name. It's dear sirs, that kind of stuff irritates me no end. You know my name, you're emailing me. So it just started at a lower level, because when you get correspondence that's on letterheaded paper, sometimes you need to send a letter. I understand that, but not everything needs to be in letterhead format, because if you go into the psyche of things, letters are more formal. So our clients then think it's an even bigger deal than it is. But having an email where you use my name and you say kind regards, and we're not at dear sirs and yours faithfully every time you send an email, because you lower the tone. And that's a big thing that I think lots of lawyers still do. They can't communicate with me, and they almost get their backs up when I do call it out and I say, well, you know my name, you can call me by my name. It's not it's that common courtesy that keeps the kind of flames with the lawyers lower, and the tone in which they correspond is so important, because if the lawyers can't communicate on a collaborative level, what hope do the clients have? So
agreed.
That I think sometimes a lot of it stems from the lawyers battling, and the clients maybe don't even know what's going on. So having that open conversation where you can pick up the phone, or you see them at events and you're not having that duel, you're saying hello, how are you, those kind of things that keep the tone, because there's no need for it anymore. Maybe I'm just this is one of my massive bugbears, I don't know if you can tell, but it just infuriates me, because we're people, we're not robots. When that email lands in my inbox, it irritates me, and then it just creates the problems that repeats and repeats and repeats.
Yeah.
Or the lawyers that ignore correspondence for months on end, and your clients getting understandably irritated because nothing's happening, but I can't force them to respond to me. And then that creates a battle, because then you almost end up having to issue out of necessity to get a response. So you're going through the court system just to get them to play ball. So I think the lawyers have a lot to answer for and are quite key in how to keep things amicable. But I'll get off my rant now. I'm done with I'm done with that.
I think you're very right. You know, if the lawyers create an atmosphere of collaboration, that they're, you know, jointly trying to support this couple through this transition, it's a very different approach than having a lawyer who's, you know, fighting the other lawyer. And I think people don't always understand that. One of the things I always tell people to ask when they're interviewing lawyers and trying to define who they want to work with is ask them if they know your spouse's lawyer, if they know, of course, who it is. Because that makes a big difference. If it's some, you know, first of all, they roll their eyes or they seem to not like them, that's not necessarily helpful. If they say, oh, yes, I work with them a lot, that's really good, because it means they're used to coming to agreements with them and to collaborating with them.
Completely. And I think the problem that maybe lawyers have, especially maybe more junior lawyers, is that they think they need to be aggressive to be heard. Don't get me wrong, I can play with the best of them, but I don't want to start off all you know, the constant aggression through correspondence and the way in which things are worded. You can be firm in your position, but you don't need to be rude, or you don't need to make threats. You can say it in a matter of fact terminology that isn't going to get people's backs up, because when I have to inevitably show my client that letter, all it's going to do is entrench their position further, because they're irritated or they're angry. And then we just end up in this battle of aggressive letters, and no progress is being made. And clients are spending thousands of pounds in correspondence when actually all we need to do is pick up the phone.
Yeah. And then you end up, instead of negotiating what actually matters here, you know, you're having conversations about whether he really did, you know, treat her badly at that dinner last week. And it's completely irrelevant really to the case. And I agree that the lawyers have to play a role in stopping that kind of temptation and helping their client be constructive.
Yeah.
So Corinne, are there any, I guess if you had to choose the top mistakes that people make that lead to a much more acrimonious and potentially litigated divorce, is there anything in particular that you see as being that big mistake to avoid?
I think my bugbear would be, and I touched on it before, the internet, unfortunately.
Yeah.
People Googling what they think is going to happen and making that decision at a very early stage, and then being very close-minded.
Yeah.
I say internet has its absolute place and its absolute value, but don't make presumptions when you don't understand the law and the process.
Yeah. And that's the hardest. I mean, when I have clients whose spouse is either not getting advice or is getting advice from friends or ChatGPT or whatnot, you can't even have a reasonable conversation, because they're operating in a completely fictitious world of where they think they're entitled to X, Y, or Z. And so you can't really bring them back to reality and have that conversation. I think if only they had a coach or a lawyer who could tell them.
Exactly. They've made that decision from very early on. They're entrenched in it. They're not budging. And it makes our life incredibly difficult trying to get them out of that.
I'm sure. Yeah. So Bethan, is that the one you would choose as well as the biggest mistake you see people make that leads to litigation?
Yeah, and I think I am a broken record at this point, but the not getting advice early enough, or what they do is they take that advice, but then they ignore it, and then they go away, they do it themselves because they think they know better, and then they come 6-9 months down the line and it's absolutely chaotic and it's carnage, and then they're like, well, fix it.
Yeah, it's a lot harder to fix than to get it right the first time around, isn't it?
Completely. And having that ability to say to them, look, I appreciate it's going to cost money. We cost money. There's no two ways about it. But it's often where you spend your money. And having that advice early on, yes, it's money out of your bank account, but it's well worth that money, because otherwise you may potentially create a problem that you don't know about because you seek advice for a reason. And it's listening to that advice. You may not like it, but we're not here just to say yes to everything you say.
Yeah.
But acknowledging and understanding that and taking time to digest it, because sometimes we're going to have really kind of deep conversations about childcare arrangements, or it's difficult for them to comprehend a new life. And I understand that, but it's that real key to get advice early on and listen to it.
Yes.
Otherwise, there's just no point. There's no point in taking that advice.
And back to that point around, operating in a realm of reality, what people also don't realize is that even if they manage to bully their ex into saying yes to whatever they think is the right way forward, there is a final validation by the court, and specifically with a financial order, if you want it to become legally binding. It's not a rubber stamping exercise, and the court is going to review whether it's fair and sustainable, reasonable, all of that.
Yeah.
And so it's going to come back to bite you at some point anyway.
Exactly.
So you might as well do it properly and not have to then review all your agreements because it's been rejected by the court.
Yeah.
Completely. And having that ability to again understand that, and you take advice from professionals for a reason. So completely, Chloe, you can bully them into a consent order and it's chucked off to the court, and then they lose their minds when the judge understandably will say, hang on a minute, I don't understand these figures, they don't seem fair. And then you've got to repeat the process all over again.
That's exactly it.
It's got to be, I think people don't understand or don't put enough importance on what fair is. And obviously it's different to each case depending on financial means and how old they are and the children, and there's so many variables, but acknowledging that it's, again, not just digging your heels in because I want it. It's being fair in the round, and well, fair enough to get it signed off by a judge at the end of it.
Yes, exactly.
So it's being sensible, and exactly, you use the right words, bullying and pressuring them just to say yes for the sake of it doesn't work, because at the end of the day you've got to get someone else's independent approval. It's not just about getting them to sign on the dotted line, because that's why there's a safety mechanism of the court system.
Exactly.
Even if you've been in through the court system on a contentious matter, they're still going to check it at the end, so you may as well try it the first time.
Yeah. And so they're going to hear that advice at some point, whether it's too late or not. So just to wrap things up, I like to finish with tips. And so maybe I'll ask each of you if you can share 3 tips to someone who is trying to keep their divorce under control and, as low conflict as possible. Maybe Corinne, you want to go first?
Keep the lines of communication open, being willing to talk, have an open mind as to options, and get to see a lawyer earlier rather than leaving it till later, because in the end the early advice is the stuff that actually can make your life a lot easier.
Yeah, and then save you money in the end, actually, that you're trying to avoid spending. Thanks. Bethan, what would yours be?
I think making sure that your lawyer's the right fit for you, and taking that time to meet them, because like I said earlier, not everyone's going to be the right fit for me, and vice versa with Corinne. So it's not just about rushing off to get a lawyer that looks the part. It's, can you get on with them, and can you have those conversations, and do you trust them? And I think that's one of the real key things, is that our relationship is so important because they have to trust what we say. Not being able to do that, there's almost no point in having me. So I think definitely number one is making sure you like them, you fit with them, and that's a cohesive working relationship. And I think being open-minded, not just being in an entrenched position. Your position might be right, but it might not be right, and trying to understand why that is. And then having that ability to be able to speak to different people. So everybody has a place, like Corinne said, your friends are your friends for a commiseration drink or having a movie night, but they're not there to be your advisors. And if you've going through a really difficult time and you're not being able to maybe regulate your emotions, don't waste money on your lawyers, because we're not trained therapists. We can listen at the end of the phone, but we can't make any meaningful changes for you there. So understanding that you may need to speak to somebody else other than just a lawyer, and having a coach and having a financial advisor, having that key people around you that isn't just your lawyer, because we can't do everything, and we would be wrong to say that we could.
I don't think anyone could. There's too many dimensions to a divorce.
Completely.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that idea of a team. And again, back to Corinne's point earlier, it is scary to spend money at a time of uncertainty, where even very wealthy people are worried about spending money for their divorce because they don't know what's coming next. But you need to be surrounded. And I think one of the things that I've seen lead to really poor, to very conflictual divorces has been either when people are not getting advice at all, or if they're surrounding themselves with the wrong people. And whether they're lawyers or other professionals or even just friends and family, if you're surrounded by people who are winding you up and encouraging conflict and bad-mouthing your ex and telling you should ask for more, you can get more, etc.,
Exactly.
that can be really detrimental. And they think they're helping, of course, but it really just makes things a lot more acrimonious and just a lot more polarized.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more.
Well, thank you both so much for joining me. It was a great conversation. I hope it'll help people to think about some of the things they can avoid doing and those they can do to try and keep things on track and really just avoid all the unnecessary cost and conflict, stress, etc., that comes from going to war over your divorce. Thank you
Thank
both
you
very
so much,
much.
Chloe.
Thank you,
Lovely to
Chloe.
see you.
Bye.
Bye.